Okay, good morning, everyone. I see lots of people joining us this morning for our very, very exciting live webinar for our members. I'm delighted to be joined by Mark Chick, Senior Partner for Bishop Sewell. Morning, Mark.
Good morning, Bob. Hello. Yes,
thanks
good to be this morning.
Thank you ever so much for putting this together. Of course, this is really timely. This one, as you see from our screen, leasehold question time. But so we'll do a few introductions. We'll have a bit of preamble, and I'll let you talk through the slides, Mark. And then I think this time we'll take all the questions in one go at the end. So if anyone watching wants to put in their questions into the chat, Jack will be monitoring those as we go along, and then we'll get Mark to deal with those after we've done all the slides this time, I think. To kick off, morning, Caroline in the admin office, who will be monitoring our slides.
Good morning, everyone.
Thanks, Caroline. And we've got Jackie as well, who will be keeping an eye on the chat.
Good morning.
Morning, Jackie. And John Ray's making sure our recordings and our technical stuff is all working. Morning, John.
Good morning.
Lots of people still joining, which is absolutely fabulous. As I say, as the slide says, leasehold question time with the FPRA, the reforms. This is leasehold reform. Of course, when we set this up, Mark, we didn't realise we'd be doing this the day after the Queen's speech, which of course, obviously quite historical, because sadly Her Majesty the Queen wasn't well enough to attend in person. So Prince Charles had the opportunity to read the government's next phase of legislative programme. So the question is, Mark, the big question of the day, does it involve leasehold reform?
Okay, well, I'm glad you asked me that question. Yes, well, first of all, good morning, everybody. It's great to be with you all. Queen's speech doesn't really say that much from the leasehold side. Lots of interesting news for the private rented sector. But the government just basically restates its aims in the commentary that we've seen there. So the government says that it's going to continue its programme of making it cheaper and easier for people to extend their lease and buy their freehold. They refer back to the fact that it's part of their seminal programme to implement leasehold and common hold reform. And they say that they're going to continue to work closely with the Competition and Markets Authority as their investigation into mis-selling continues, and they're going to encourage developers that haven't yet engaged with them to do so. So there is a sort of restatement of aims, really, I suppose, rather than anything specific in terms of news about a bill or. But it's part of a legislative programme, and we know that following on from the Law Commission's report in the 13th Law Commission's significant work into the leasehold sector, the government's commitment in response to that to look at that sensibly and to see what legislation can be brought forward. Some of which we're going to be talking about this morning, because of course we're going to be talking about, amongst other things, the Leasehold Reform Ground Rent Act. But it perhaps is just a good time to set the scene and say there's quite a lot going on in leasehold at the moment generally. So, I mean, Bob, does that accord with your sort of your reading of the Queen's speech?
It does, yeah. I've not had a chance to look at it in the detail because I was busy out town crying yesterday, so I'm sort of catching up on that. But obviously we've got the Building Safety Bill, which is now an act, which obviously is going to have lots of implications for us as leaseholders. I'm really proud of the FPRA's contribution to the Building Safety Act. I think, you know, we've reached probably the best possible compromise that we could on behalf of our members. Of course, our members are landlords in many cases as well as leaseholders, being RMCs and RTM. So I think we reached a really good, reasonable position with the building safety. The government, in the Home Office, which is one of our big frustrations of the FPRA, is how disjointed leasehold reforms are, because obviously we've got the Fire Safety Act, which is being led by the Home Office, and the government are reconsulting on the personal evacuation plans, otherwise known as PEEPs, which again will have a big implication for our members. You know, having to sort of have these personal plans, you know, for people with disabilities living in their buildings. And I've certainly raised a number of concerns about that, because, you know, certainly that those of us that are sort of volunteer RMCs, we've got no idea who sleeps in our flats at night in our blocks, you know, either because they're Airbnb or people who have had visitors who may well have a disability, and then they're not going to knock on my door saying, you know, I've got somebody who needs access requirements, staying in our flats overnight. So it'll be very interesting to see how those particular reforms sort of work out after the sort of reconsultation on the peeps on the Fire Safety Act. So yeah, there's lots of stuff around building safety, fire safety, and obviously, that's why it's really important. People, our members join and rejoin the FPRA, because we've got all the experts like Mark and others who are able to support our members navigating some of that. But obviously today is more about the actual reform of the leasehold system. I've been reappointed by the government on the Commonhold Council for another year. So I guess you could conclude from that the government are certainly committed to doing something with Commonhold. I think the jury's still out about where that will kind of fit, and more importantly, where leasehold will fit in that. I know certainly one of the concerns that I have on behalf of our members is making sure that leasehold suddenly doesn't end up being the poor relation, and we end up devaluing people with a leasehold flat because Commonhold is suddenly this sort of gold standard, really. So it'll be interesting to see how that sort of navigates through as some of these bills potentially become law, really. So if you're are you happy to crack on with the slides, Mark?
Yes, absolutely. I was just going to just say one last thing on the Building Safety Act. Two things, actually. First of all, this webinar this afternoon that we're hosting here at Bishop Sewell, which people will be welcome to attend if they want to know more about the Building Safety Act. It's at 2 o'clock. You just need to go to the link on the Bishop Sewell website and sign up in advance. You can't join once it's sort of started, as it were. And you'd be welcome to come and listen to myself and Justin Bates, Mark Chambers, who's a well-known expert around the building safety field, talking about that. I think also, yes, you just touched on one very important thing there, Bob, which is your reappointment to the Commonhold Council. And so just going back to where we were with the Queen's speech and what that means for leasehold, and to set this in the context of leasehold reform more generally, it's clear government is continuing with its programme. What it's not clear about at the moment from the Queen's speech is what piece of legislation, if any, will come in during this particular term of Parliament. Now, we've got another 2 terms of this Parliament left until May 2024 before they would have to call an election. Of course, election might happen sooner. That's a different point. One could comment on that politically ad infinitum, I suppose, whether there'd be a change of Prime Minister, all sorts of things would happen. But, just assuming everything sits on a level course, and that's something people have been asking about, when is all this going to come in? Well, you can see that there's been a programme of getting stuff done, and there's a reiteration of that now. There's clearly a keen commitment to restate the objectives. And indeed, the Queen's speech, it mentions the Leasehold Reform Ground Rent Act, and it says that they're going to publish guidance in relation to the enforcement regime that will go with that. We'll come on to talk about that in a moment. Another commitment was banning leasehold houses, and that's something which the government has said it would do. And once again, no firm commitment to a bill or an act during this particular legislative session, but is something the government made a ministerial pledge to do. And if you think back to the position with the ground rent ban, that's something that was a ministerial pledge by Sajid Javid when he was the housing minister on the floor of the House in December 2017. It took 5 years to get to the point where we got an act, but we did get there. So I think we can assume that these things will also follow because Parliament has said it will do them, but it just is a question of when. Okay, well, with that in mind, perhaps we could just move on, in the words of Chris Whitty, to the next slide, perhaps. Okay, so this is what we're going to be talking about this morning. So this is a session overview, if you like. Obviously, we know perhaps about some things that have happened with the Department for Levelling Up Housing Communities, or the Ministry of Housing, Community and Local Government, as it once was. We've also seen CMA market intervention. We've got the Ground Rent Act, I've mentioned that already, and there's these proposals to change things in relation to leasehold enfranchisement, so lease extensions to 90 years and the like, along with the Building Safety Act and the Regulation of Managing Agents. So we're just going to talk initially just a little bit about each of those. We've got a time budget of about 45 minutes to an hour. I know some of you may well have questions, in which case do keep those coming in through the chat box, and we will manage those either as we go or probably at the end of the little talk we're going to do now. And Bob, if you want to chip in as we go, please do. Feel free, because it's better as a dialogue than a monologue, of course. Okay, perhaps just go to the next slide if we could, and that'll just show us talk about this. So the Department for Levelling Up Housing Communities, I've just about learnt to say that now. I had my tongue around MHCLG, but DLUC, that was a difficult one. They consulted on the 11th of January on this year on changing 2 things. Around the qualification criteria for buying your freehold. So if you've got a mixed-use building, if you've got commercial and residential in the building, as the law stands at the minute, you need more than 25% of the building to be in non-residential use in order for that building to qualify for the right to buy your freehold. And that assessment is made on a net internal floor area basis. And if you have a building like that and you want to buy your freehold, it may come down to expert measurement to decide whether you qualify or not. Now, when the Law Commission looked at this, as they did in their extensive report that came out on the 20th of July, I think it was 2020, following a lot of initial work, some of which I contributed to along with other commentators in the sector, the Law Commission concluded that they thought it would be okay to leave these limits where they were. So they said, look, you know what? It's all quite well understood. There's a parallel regime here between freehold and right to manage. 25% seems on balance to us to be about right. Let's leave it there. But it's clear that government, with the political will behind it, when looking to try to make legislation or to take this into effect, is considering a different option, because their stated objective is to make it cheaper or easier for people to buy their freehold or extend their lease. Now, if you're going to make it cheaper or easier, clearly increasing the access of rights to people would be a good thing. So what they've talked about doing, and they consulted on, was what the industry and other commentators would or other professionals in the sector would, and other recognised bodies as well. I mean, I think the FPRA commented on that one as well.
We did.
Would think about changing those limits so that rather than 25% is 50%. So you've got a building, it could have a fairly large shopping centre even downstairs, and upstairs you've got flats. And provided that it's not more than 50% of the building used for non-residential purposes, and that's assessed on a net internal floor area basis, then that building would then qualify. So that, of course, would mean that many, many buildings that have probably been built, in all honesty, in contemplation of that you could never buy the freehold, would then qualify. And that would probably be good news for leaseholders if they wanted to buy their freeholds in that situation. What industry would think about that, what the property industry would think about that, might be a different thing, because I suspect a lot of reversionary investors that have bought shopping centres and mixed-use sites did so thinking, well, I want the yield from the shops. And the shops, of course, if they're held on shorter leases, which tends to be the case, 10 or 15-year leases, and the shops are profitable, they're paying very, very high rents. And of course, if you come to buy the freehold in a situation like that, you have to buy out that rental income. And imagine let's fictionalize this, it's Blue Water or something similar, and there's many millions of pounds worth a year of rent coming off the property. You can give people the right to buy the freehold, but of course, it's not really worth very much if they can't afford to do it. And the reason they can't afford to do it is because it's going to cost them £10 million to buy the commercial bit, and it might only be a few £100,000 to buy the residential element, because they're on long leases at low or no ground rent, let's say. So what the government also said is, well, if we do this, we would also introduce a parallel and similar requirement that there would have to be mandatory lease backs. And what that means is that you would end up in a situation where you would buy the freehold, and Blue Water, the operator in the fictional example I'm giving, or maybe we should call it White Water just to avoid any litigation over the name, I don't know, says, well, you give us, you can buy the freehold, but we will keep a long lease, a 999-year lease of this area, and that will be at a nil ground rent. So we'll continue to own that, we'll continue to receive the income, we'll get the £10 million a year worth of rent. You don't have to fund that because this remains with us, but you end up buying the freehold. So if the government did these things, if they made the leasebacks mandatory and lifted the threshold, then many, many more people would be able to buy their freeholds. So it would achieve one of the stated objectives. So that was a consultation that came out on the 11th of January of this year. Lots of people responded to it. There's no further news as to what will happen next, but you can sort of see a direction of travel there from government saying, look, this is where we would like to take this. So that's changing the limits for buying your freehold. Or indeed for the right to manage, which follows a parallel regime. So I suppose it's also worth mentioning that. So the no-fault right to take over the management of your building, 50% of the leaseholders clubbed together, they can do that. They can appoint their own manager through a process that you have to go through. Once again, if more than 25% is non-residential, you can't get the building in that way. But of course, if you change the thresholds, then you would be able to. And the case law around both freehold and RTM, they mirror each other, because the sections and the provisions in statute at the minute are more or less identical. So similar tests are applied in each case. Anyway, so that's all about buying your freehold. Let's move on to the next one if we can. So the CMA, Competition Markets Authority. So in addition to government saying, well, we want to make things better, and you've got to think back to where we started with all this, the leasehold scandal, pre-2017, the white paper on tackling unfair practices in the leasehold market. You start to think, well, were there abuses of the market? Is this a situation where there's unfair practices, people have been unfairly taken advantage of. They've signed up to leases with doubling ground rents that mean that it's going to cost them 40, 50,000 pounds, let's say, to buy the freehold to a house that costs 250,000 pounds. That can't be right. That's a mis-selling situation. That's somebody trying to, impose unfair terms on somebody. And so the government also encouraged the Competition and Markets Authority to look at this. And as you can see, there was some voluntary discussion initially with a lot of ground rent landlords. You may recall the Select Committee looked at that, and there was what was called the ground rent pledge. So a lot of ground rent owners said, we will pledge to not impose doubling or 10-year doubling rents, let's say, the things that will make the property unmarketable. So this is worth pausing here and just looking at, is all ground rent bad? Well, probably not. Is a 10-year doubling ground rent bad? Potentially, yes, because if the ground rent outstrips about 0.1% of the capital value of the property, you're going to find that a valuer is going to say that property is potentially unmortgageable, because at some point that rent might be seen as being unaffordable, or the banks, the lenders, won't like that level of rent. Now, it is a bit subjective because, of course, if the property's worth, I don't know, £250,000 and the ground rent is £300,000 a year or £400,000 a year, and that is, say, outside central London, well, if the ground rent's only let's say, £400 a year, it's probably still affordable, although it doesn't quite pass the 0.1% test. So the real question is, what happens next? Does that ground rent then go on a double? If it goes 400, 800, 1,600, £3,200, and if it does that at intervals of less than, say, 20 years, that's going to be a problem from a mortgageability point of view, from a saleability point of view. So what was done is the Competition and Markets Authority looked into this and said, well, look, there are plenty of these examples where people have imposed unfair rents on people. We consider this to be a market abuse. We want to investigate further. They did investigate further, and a number of entities entered into the regulatory settlements. And there were some regulatory settlements entered into about a year and a half ago, but then we had some more announcements further on this year. So on the 18th of March, 15 businesses that bought freeholds from Countryside, a developer, gave undertakings to remove doubling ground rents. So yeah, I suppose I've just come back to the point. A ground rent that doubles in 25 years' time, that's not really a problem, because that will keep pace with inflation. But a rent that reviews more frequently, particularly in a compounded or doubling way, is potentially going to be a problem. Although, of course, we're now in times of higher inflation than we were, so that might also be an interesting observation. Retail price index rises, well, those are, they are what they are. They're supposed to keep pace with inflation. So if your ground rent started at £200 or £300 a year and it's rebased in 10 years' time, it should still be the equivalent cost of £300 in terms of the pound in your pocket at that time. That might be an inconvenience, but that's less likely to be something that's going to make the property unsaleable. Although people might say, as ground rent becomes less palatable, or less acceptable, or less common, that may also become an issue in terms of saleability and marketability. So people will begin to want to move away from that. But there we are. So the CMA has done some of the government's work for them, which is no doubt the approach the government took. Because I mean, if you were thinking, sitting back broad brush, how do I produce the effects I want? I want to get rid of these sector abuses. I want to see some redress. This is a good way of doing it. So for a lot of developers, particularly those that could afford to make these changes, they were very happy to go in and say to people, look, we'll go and vary your lease. We'll change the rent provisions. We're not having a 10-year doubler anymore. Maybe it's 25 years, or it's a flat rent for the remainder of the lease term. We'll even make a contribution towards your legal costs for doing that, because we want to be seen to be, in the good books here. We do not want the reputational damage that will come with this. The step that the slide talks about, which is a step further, I suppose, is those that have bought ground rent, so ground rent investors, so some of the larger funds. Now, people don't like to talk about this, but people who have pensions and other things may find that indirectly their money is invested in things like ground rent, because it provides a long-term stable income. And of course, if you're receiving a pension, that's exactly what you want, a long-term stable income. So the impact of this, it's a sort of, what can the market tolerate? Where can this come from? But it's a sort of an unanswered question, but I anticipate that even funds that purchase these things now recognise that, particularly the way the writing is on the wall for ground rent in new leases, that it would be appropriate to try to tone back the ground rent being received. But of course, that has a big effect on the value of those assets. There'll be a write down in the value of those underlying assets. So there we are. So then that income has to be found another way. maybe inflation or higher interest rates would mean that income could be found another way, actually, in the current climate. But it's something that historically, or in the last 10 to 15 to 20 years of economic history, has been harder and harder to find. So there we are.
I think that's a really interesting point about pensions there, Mark. I think that's really, really interesting. Yeah.
I think a lot of people who campaign don't recognise that. I mean, obviously, it must be capable of being dealt with in other jurisdictions, but one has to go and find an asset class that gives you a stable long-term income, and ground rent is that. So, you might almost say that it's one of the, if there was to be a good use of ground rent, that would be a good use of ground rent. There we are. Okay, well, let's talk about ground rent. So let's go to the next one then. So here we have the Ground Rent, Leasehold Reform Ground Rent Act 2022. Now, obviously, this is a really interesting thing. That the government said it would act to ban ground rent for new leases, and it has now done so. So as of the 8th of February, this received the royal assent. It comes into force on the 30th of June of this year, and after that time, any new long lease of a flat that is granted can't have a ground rent. So the ground rent must be 0, nil, a peppercorn, nothing. Now, there are some exceptions to that, some of which rate certain things like Islamic finance arrangements, where there's a rent-to-buy type scheme deployed. Shared ownership leases, you can have a rent because you can have a rent on the bit you don't own because you've got to pay market rent on that. And also, if you renew your lease on a voluntary basis, so if you come to a voluntary deal with the freeholder to renew your lease, then you can pay a ground rent, but the ground rent can only be the ground rent that was paid under the old lease, and it can only be for the remainder of the old lease term. So what we'd be talking about there, if let's say my lease has got another 80 years to run, just typically, well, I mean, that's a bad example because of marriage value, but and I want to extend that lease, and the landlord says I can make that lease 150 years long, let's say. Well, the ground rent I'm currently paying, that could continue until we get to the end of the 80 years. But after that point in time on the new lease, or when that old lease would have expired, it has to be 0. So you can't impose a rent in any new lease term that's added on. Now, of course, this doesn't affect extensions under statute because they're for nil rent anyway. So it probably pushes more people towards using the statutory lease extension if they want to extend their lease on a voluntary basis. And they can't agree suitable terms with the landlord. It also means landlords are probably going to offer slightly different terms. They're certainly going to offer terms that say you can keep a ground rent, but not increase it after the end of the lease term. And there are penalties for non-compliance. So the local authority weights and measures department is going to be responsible for the enforcement of this one. And they are going to have the right to impose fines, which can range from, say, £500 to £30,000. And if you pay your ground rent under a lease that's been granted incorrectly, so if after commencement a lease is granted and the lease says you must pay a ground rent and it shouldn't have said that, you are entitled to have that ground rent repaid together with 8% interest. And there are penalties for the landlord in that circumstance. So I think, to answer the question at the bottom of the slide there, will it lead to a shift in the market? I think it will. It will shift to a big shift. We're probably seeing it already, to be honest. I don't know if you're seeing that in terms of the questions that your members are asking about lease extensions, Bob. But
yes, definitely. I think it's interesting about the weights and measures being responsible for the enforcement. It'll be as a former local authority councillor, I retired last week, but it'd be very interesting to see whether the local authorities are giving additional resources, because I think because I think potentially this could be a significant burden on council taxpayers. If they're going to be having to enforce this. So I
assume that some of the costs will be recovered from those they enforce against, because if these fines are quite large, I don't know how that would be reallocated. Obviously, that's a budgetary question, isn't it?
Yeah.
But if someone's paying £30,000 fine, presumably the local authority that collects that is going to be able to have some.
I think that would be the government line, Mark. Having spent 20 years in a local authority, obviously they need staff to do it, and and all that sort of thing. So I think the jury's out on how effective the regime will be, but certainly it's a very clear process, and actually I think it's what we've been arguing for a long time. I think it's the right. It's a really good piece of legislation.
It's a common sense measure, isn't it? But the Queen's speech says that the one thing that we do here is that they will publish accompanying guidance for enforcement officers and consumers. So there's going to be some stuff written about this. I wonder, this is a little bit like the 1987 Act, unfortunately, isn't it? So, it's a criminal offence to dispose of a freehold without first offering it to the tenants and the so-called right of first refusal under that Act. Yet, how many actual prosecutions have there ever been? I'm a practitioner with 20 years plus experience, and I'm not aware of any. So it does come down to enforcement. Same thing in the back of the 87 Act, all those provisions that you can be fined if you don't provide insurance information and prescribed information relating to service charges. Once again, prosecutions are by the local authority. They're very, very rare indeed. I suppose what we can perhaps say is local authorities are now more geared up towards things like licensing because of the changes in relation to licensing of private rented properties. And so perhaps it's an extension of that function that might perhaps mean them taking further steps. I mean, it's certainly, in my practice, I certainly do see evidence of those types of enforcements carried on where people don't have the relevant license, they get fined and the fines are substantial. So it's possible there's a phase shift, but I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, you almost want centralized resource and guidance on how to do it. And obviously how government decides to implement this is up to them and up to local government as well.
Indeed, and of course, local government, of course, is obviously very disjointed as well, because weights and measures in my area sits with the county council under training standards. Obviously, licensing sits with the local borough council, responsible for sort of housing licensing. So it's a very disjointed. Obviously, we're not here to talk about reform of local government, and I suspect that would be a long time coming as well. So, I think it'd be very. I certainly think in authorities with elected mayors where all the powers kind of sit in one place, I think this is a really quite a good move, really. But I think for some of those other, particularly smaller local authorities where responsibilities are split, but with other local authorities, I think could be very interesting, really. I
think it will come back to actually it may enforce itself to a certain extent, because if someone's going to buy a lease, let's say they're buying a flat, and for whatever reason, the ground rent has been imposed incorrectly after the 30th of June, that point is going to be raised, and the landlord is going to be very keen to see that removed from the lease anyway. There's going to need to be a deed of rectification. So, there's probably a self-policing element to that, so that when the landlord fears that there's going to be enforcement action, they're going to take remedial steps immediately themselves, meaning that we don't get to the point of enforcement, potentially. What some developers looked at doing was seeing whether they could exchange agreements for leases, because you can exchange an agreement now that will give a lease, you give birth to a lease after the 30th of June, say, and that would be legitimate to impose a ground rent. But that's really sort of, narrowing things down just as we're shutting the door on this, actually, because ultimately that can only apply to a fixed number of cases. So yeah, we are going to see a change in market practice there.
Yeah, and I think just briefly on that, of course, the importance of using a professional conveyancer as well in this process, because actually, a lot of the things like that are often missed.
Yes.
As conveyancing is often dumbed down, people go to Dr. Google, find a cheap conveyancer, they do it online, and they're not a leasehold specialist like yourself, Mark, and then you suddenly find all sorts of things that are sort of fallen under the radar when people have sort of bought and sold leasehold property, really. So
I think that's something that's very, very much worth saying. I think this is a wider question, but you could ask the question: would the ills of the leasehold scandal have happened had people had access to the right kind of advice? And the answer to that is presumably no, because had I or any of the members of ALEP, for instance, been consulted in any of those properties, we'd have said, do not take this, negotiate back on this ground rent. It's not acceptable, drafted as it is. But unfortunately, it's the race to the bottom, and people want to go to what you might call a factory firm or an online operation where they take a view that says, well, these things have been bought and sold before, let's just wave it all through. The people dealing with it are not the highest level qualified people in the world. And it's a process, which on one level, conveyancing is a process, actually. I don't want to sort of make any bones about that. But of course, it's just when one of these highly technical points comes up, or someone should have read the contract properly and they didn't, that these really, really unfortunate results have happened. So yeah, considering it's the largest investment any individual's likely to make in their lifetime, it would seem obvious you should get good quality advice on that. But that's
absolutely. But buyer beware, and it's one of the reasons why we've always in our 50 years as an organisation, we've always argued for proper regulation of the sector. Whether that be conveyancing, managing agents, or whatever it is, because actually, all the good guys, people like yourself, Mark, aren't afraid of regulation because actually you're doing the right thing in the first place.
Well, we're already regulated by the SRA, don't forget. Obviously, we are probably the most regulated profession known to mankind, or people kind of one might now say. And I think you've got to look at But so yes, there are other variants of conveyances, even like licensed conveyances. They're all regulated. The problem is it's access to education, skills, and training, which is one of the reasons that we set ALAP up in the first place, because there's a dearth of professionals that are willing to engage properly with some of these issues. And maybe government's going to make this easier for people because they're going to make the law simpler. Which, if that happens, then some of this will fall away. Although I think there are still going to be disputes. I don't think I'm going to be necessarily looking for something to do, because I think there are still going to be plenty of issues arising out of leases, no matter what happens.
Yeah, and particularly if Commonhold comes out, because one of the things that we've raised with Commonhold is and I think it came up with Philip at Rainier, our AGM, was it's easy to manage an empty building, but actually as soon as you put people into it, it doesn't matter whether it's leasehold or Commonhold.
No,
actually, lawyers and solicitors and barristers are going to become involved, aren't they?
Well, it's only because people will fall out with each other, as has been seen in other jurisdictions where Commonhold is a feature of life. I mean, unfortunately, arguments between adjoining owners are a feature of life, and it doesn't matter what system you have; they'll still be engaged in arguing with each other. It's just the context will be different. Exactly. Let's move on and look at the next one. Actually, so here we are. So, so this is something I think it's important. Oh, we've gone too far forward.
No.
Right. One more on from there. That's the one.
Thanks, Caroline.
Yeah, so there's been some confusion around this. The government, in its initial announcement back as MHCLG, as it was before it became DLUC, in the 7th of January 2021, said a lot of things. And they got reported by the press. In fact, actually, there's a headline in the Daily Telegraph that said you're going to get a 999-year lease extension at a zero rent for nil cost. Well, that wasn't right for two reasons. Number one, it would never be at nil cost under statute. And number two, that wasn't actually a proposal. It was a proposal of suggestion for the way in which the law will be reformed, but it wasn't going to come in anytime soon. It was just something which has been discussed. Now, government has made these commitments. So we've mentioned the Commonhold Council already. We've talked about, well, they looked at putting a cap on ground rent. That hasn't been the subject of any actual legislation yet, but we do have the Leasehold Reform Ground Rent Bill, or Act rather, banning ground rent for new leases. They say a number of other things. They say they're going to abolish marriage value. Now, that's quite a big thing, because if your lease is under 80 years, you have to pay marriage value. So that would be a really significant rebalancing of interests between leaseholder and freeholder. And it would be very political. It would be, an economic decision. You're going to take money and move it from one set of private property owners to another. So on one level, why should the leaseholder be given a windfall because of a change in the law? Particularly if the leaseholder is actually an investor and the freeholder is an investor. Doesn't seem particularly logical. But there's an impetus here. The government's firm terms of reference were the most political terms of reference ever given to the Law Commission. The mere brief of making it cheaper or easier is actually sets about a political objective. Now, so that being the case, and the nub of this being to try to make it easier or drive down the cost, government said, look, we're going to do these things. In the future, we're going to make the standard plus 90-year lease extension a 990-year lease extension at nil ground rent. That was something that was in the Law Commission's output paper as a recommendation. So it's not a surprise they said they would adopt that. The Commonhold Council, we've talked about, that exists. Now, the idea of the leasehold calculator, many people have leasehold calculators, one on our website. In reforming the law in relation to valuation, which is a separate and massive topic in itself, what government would hope to do is try and make the process simpler. So one thing that's talked about was bringing in a calculator that would be like a prescribed calculator for simple cases, so that rather than arguing and potentially going to tribunal, there'd be a sort of one-size-fits-all solution. Both the freeholder and the leaseholder would be able to put the numbers into a calculator and they would be told the answer. That would be it. There would be no debate about what the premium would be, and there'd be some costs and other things to pay, and it would make it simpler. So that's another good idea, but it's a good idea that's nowhere near the statute books yet. And I think that's the really important thing to focus on. So this is all stuff the government said it would like to do, but it is not doing it now. There is no bill or act, and there's nothing in the Queen's speech even about this, but it could come up in the future. And the same would be said in relation to the abolition of marriage value. So abolishing marriage value, that's something which is going to be, political. It's going to rebalance significant property interests. It raises human rights issues. You could expect to see a challenge potentially on that. The Law Commission took advice from Human Rights Council on that very point. But everyone's asking the question, when will that change? And the truth is, no one knows the answer. I mean, it's quite possible that the DLUC are going to resource to look at some of this. But of course, when are they going to do that? They've only got a certain amount of time, effort, and money that can be placed into this. They've got a fairly large legislative team, as far as I'm aware. They are committed to these reforms. Take the example that we gave at the beginning of the commitment to ban ground rent for new leases. Given in 2017, it took 5 years to get to the point where that became a thing on the statute book. So we might see a similar timeline. I mean, I might be wrong, because it might be someone will say, well, look, you can make a fairly simple amendment to Schedule 13 or Schedule 7 of the 1993 Act, and you can just say the landlord share of the managed value shall be nil. But I feel that if you do that in isolation without doing anything else at the same time, you will end up with a Human Rights Act challenge. And so the question of doing that, in my mind at least, is something that has to be done in the context of some other changes around valuation, some of which may actually bring things up from the landlord's perspective, because there's got to be a sense of balance or fairness here. And this would all have to be debated by Parliament as well. And you know that we don't yet know what the will of politicians would be around something like this. So yes, I think there will be some changes in the law in relation to valuation. We don't know when. I don't think they're going to be coming immediately. There we are.
I think that's a really interesting point, actually. And certainly, if I was to throw my 2 pence in my prediction, I wouldn't expect any of these things to be appearing in this current before next general election.
No,
and I think it will be for the political parties to decide whether these things should be in manifestos going into an election. Because as you rightly say, these are very complex areas, really. The Commonwealth Council will be the one that that may start to do some work potentially. Say I've been appointed for another year. That might happen before a 2023 election, or or 24 if it goes that far. But I think the others, for all the reasons you said, I think they're going to be subject to challenge and sort of political interference, if I can put it that way, really, because as you say, it's all about balance, isn't it? There's a very strong leasehold lobby, which is very important, and we supported much of that. And we talk about it as a pair of scales at the FPRA. And the scales are very much moving in the direction of leaseholders, from what we've seen. Has it gone far enough? Possibly not. But actually, those freeholders and landlords have got to be protected in a fair way as well, haven't they? So
they have indeed. Okay, well, let's just we've got a question that's come in, which is a really good question. I'm going to read it out so everybody can hear what's being asked. So, out of curiosity, why did the government propose 990 years rather than the gold standard of 999 years? Why 99 years and then not 999? So if in talking about the thing as it says on the slide there, the proposed extension to 990 years at a nil ground rent. So at the moment, the law says if you do a lease extension using a Section 42 notice under the 1993 Act, the statutory right of lease extension, where you have to have owned the property for 2 years, the lease extension you will get is 90 years on top of the unexpired lease term. So if your lease was, let's say, 50 years long, you get a new 140-year lease. Now, this will mean you'll get 990 years added onto the unexpired term of the lease. Why 990? Why not 999? Well, because the Leasehold Reform Housing and Urban Development Act 1993 imposes a right to break the lease on the part of the landlord at certain intervals. So 5 years before the expiry of the new lease term, whenever that will be, and also at 12 months before the end of the old lease term. Now, the reason for that is because buildings might have a finite lifespan. So you would perhaps want to redevelop the building at some point in time. If you've extended all the leases in all flat 999-year leases, then, or maybe you've got only one of those in there, let's say, and you've got rights to break the other leases to get the building back or the site back because it needs to be redeveloped, then the person who's got the 999-year lease would be able to sort of play dog in a manger and say, well, what's your price? Because you've got to redevelop the site. I don't want to sell. So the Act actually has, Schedule 14 sets out compensation provisions, which say that if the landlord has to take possession of the property because of redevelopment for some reason, and it's got to be legitimate, it's not, oh, I just fancy doing this. It's got to be genuine, settled intention to redevelop. You've got the funding, you've got the planning, you've got everything else. And you go to court and you get a court order that says, yes, the court's looked at this would be a legitimate thing. Then, and only then, the leaseholder will be paid compensation, which is fair compensation that reflects the market value of the property. so what the flat's worth, but no enhancement because they are in some way able to hold up the development. So the answer to the question is why 990? Because that's effectively 10 successive additions of 90 years onto the term. And the idea being that perhaps these break rights will be preserved in that system so that these leases would then be coextensive, coterminous with other leases that may have been extended under the statute before, and that there is this opportunity then to break the lease if that's necessary for redevelopment. Having said that, the redevelopment cases are very, very rare indeed. I mean, of course, if your lease is long, the thing is going to arise probably long after all of us are not here anymore. But, you know, for a shorter lease that's renewed, then it can be more relevant. But once again, you've got to ask the question, what is the prospect of a redevelopment happening? And it's no risk particularly to the tenant because there is it's perfectly mortgageable. It's actually mandatory under statute. You can't take it out anyway. So you get market value compensation, just not more than. So I think that's the reason for the 990 rather than some other term. So there, I hope that answers the question.
I think that's a really interesting point. Thanks. Yeah.
Let's go to the next slide. Let's see where we are with that. So
thanks, Caroline.
The Building Safety Act. So this is a biggie. We've got a whole webinar devoted to that this afternoon because it makes significant changes to the way in which high-risk buildings over 18 metres, are designed, constructed and managed. You can't underestimate the impact of what's going to be called the Building Safety Regulator, which is going to be part of the Health and Safety Executive. And that entity is going to have responsibility for the oversight of the construction, the building regulations, all of the things that go into the materials that will create one of these sorts of buildings. Now, of course, we are all aware of the horrific tragedy of the Grenfell Tower, and I suppose we are looking back to that in 2017 and saying, well, never again. Why did we get to the position that we are in relation to tall buildings and cladding? And so the government has done a number of things. So first of all, a complete reform of the way in which materials will be approved and planning and building regulations will apply to those. But then also a number of things as part of the overall scheme of redress for leaseholders affected by those issues. So we've had the ACM and the non-ACM cladding remediation funds. We've had the Waking Watch Fund. We've also had a sort of a volte-face, if you like, from the government around about the 14th of February of this year, in which there was going to be a regime under which there still is a contribution regime, which would sit in parallel to the service charge regime. So if you've got these issues in your building, you would have to pay for them because the landlord would carry out remedial work and this cost would be passed back on to the leaseholder. Now, there are now some restrictions on that. So there's a cap on the amount that can be asked for. And there's also provisions that relate to the way in which the landlord can go and ask this money. So before they can start to make any kind of demand, any kind of remediation work, they are going to have to, first of all, have exhausted all other avenues. That would be compensation funds, in potentially suing other parties that got involved in the construction, design and management of the site to start with, and other avenues of redress such as insurance and other things. And then and only then, having gone through all those steps, can they then start beginning to impose these charges on the leaseholders. So that's something which is not it's not a trivial thing. It's a very, very serious thing. Of course, it only applies to buildings of over 18 metres in height. The question would be for 11 to 18 metres, there are also the caps on service charge recovery. And indeed, the government itself has reached a sort of, a regulatory agreement, an agreement with about 35 developers who have said they will fix cladding issues themselves in sites of significance, which is obviously a very, very big thing. And they are encouraging other entities to do the same. I mean, the government's trying to come at it from two angles, I suppose. So from on the ground up in terms of making sure that there's appropriate regulation so that this can't happen again. And then from the other side, in terms of imposing restrictions on how the charges can be imposed on the leaseholders themselves. And then finally, also going out into the market to try to pursue those that have done the work in the first place to make sure that they voluntarily come in and fix the problems. So, and there's also going to be a number of things that are going to go towards the funding of this. There's a residential development property tax that's going to be imposed. That's where the builder has got net profits of more than £25 million, and they're going to pay a levy that's going to go towards some of the costs of all of this. And there are a number of other changes as well. So it's all to play for, but it's a big topic. So I don't know how many of your members have got buildings of more than 18 metres, for instance, or indeed are affected by these issues, but it can come up everywhere. I mean, I could go on further. There's a thing called the golden thread in relation to the construction, design and management of these buildings, so that all of the relevant materials are going to have to be passed down through a chain of command, if you like, so that the person who's called the appropriate person that's sort of holding the baby or the book of documents, if you like, at the end of the day, and that's most likely to be the freeholder. So there is something that could potentially affect an FPRA member if that organisation owns a building where this applies, is going to be responsible, and that's responsible with a sort of capital R, I suppose, really, for the appropriate management of the safety of that building at all times. It's an ongoing duty. It's not a one-off. You've had the book of stuff. That's it. It's an all-time duty. Quite a very significant obligation. And there was this discussion about appointing somebody called the building safety manager. This was a sort of a third-party individual that would exist as a creature of statute that could be appointed in each case. But the government then scrapped that. So we're back to the appropriate person being the person who's effectively in control of the site, probably the freeholder, with this massive legal responsibility. And I think that's going to have an impact potentially on service charges, because it's obviously going to come with a compliance burden. But I think perhaps rightly so too, because it comes back to a point of significant public safety.
Absolutely, and I think it's a really important issue, and certainly I'll be joining the webinar, and our members have all had an email. So if you're struggling to find through the Bishop Sewell website, you can go onto the email that we've sent and register for that this afternoon. That free webinar with Mark and Justin. But just on the regulator, the FPRA are represented on the residents group, so there is a resident involvement in the regulator. There's at the moment is currently an interim residents panel, which now the Building Safety Act is a law and has royal assent. That I think from October, I think the residents panel will become a statutory panel, which is in the Building Safety Act.
Yes, that's absolutely that's enshrined as well. Yes, I think that's within 12 months of commencement. So this act is in force, came into force on the 28th of April. What it means for all of us is to be decided. In fact, there's no complete copy of the act as yet on the legislation part of the government website. So once we get that, we can pull it a bit further apart and double check what's in and what's out. But yes, Justin, for instance, who's an expert commentator, is familiar with the act as it's been through all of its different stages. Okay, well, let's move on then. Let's talk about one last thing now. So regulation of managing agents. So, well, managing agents love them or hate them, I suppose one says. You know, a lot of your members probably self-manage, but we often say to people, actually, you're better off getting a managing agent, because it puts a degree of distance between you and the other people in the block. If there are issues, you can have somebody in the middle to deal with those issues. And of course, it's what they're trained to do. They're supposed to be able to consult properly under the service charge regime and do all those sorts of things. Having said that, there's no law at the minute that says to be a managing agent, you have to be in any way regulated. So you and I, Bob, could set ourselves up as a managing agent's business now, and we could receive millions of pounds of leaseholders' money, and we could either do a good job or a bad job. And no one would really be sitting there telling us what we can and can't do. So there's been some proposals for an independent regulator. The Housing Ombudsman itself calls for better regulation back in March of this year. And Lord Best produced a report in July 2019. Now, I don't know, Bob, if you've got any better knowledge on the regulation of managing agents, but I felt, because we've got a lot of content to get through, and I know we've got some questions to deal with as well in a moment. So, I propose to just leave that there.
I agree. It's a long-standing issue. I remember attending but the predecessor of MHCLG under the last Labour government, the proposed regulated managing agents, and it still never happened. So
it's something that the coalition government got its head around, actually, in a funny sort of way. That was one of the better things that came out of the coalition. They started to look at this, but then of course that got dropped. But yes. So okay, well let's go to some questions then, because I know we've got some members' questions. So let's try and deal with some.
Okay, here we go.
Oh, this is a nice one. Okay, so we've got a few here. I'll try and rattle through them if I can. So first one, landlords offered me a lease extension at a lower price than the statutory lease extension, but it's not as long. What should I do? Well, this is a valuation question, really. I think you've got to get valuation advice, talk to a surveyor or valuer expert in leasehold reform matters. You could look at one of the calculators as well and do a trade-off here. But if the lease extension is at a lower price, okay, if it's affordability, that is a good thing, obviously, from your point of view. But what is the ground rent? Is the ground rent going to increase between, now and let's say 30th of June? They could still impose a 10-year doubling rent. That would have to be checked out properly. And what are your medium to long-term interests in the property? Because it would not be a good idea to sign the property up to being unsaleable. Let's say you get a quick fix now, but then when you come to sell, someone says, well, I don't like that lease. You need to sort that out. So, some people would say only do a statutory lease extension. I would not say that. I would say just look carefully at what's being offered, get proper advice around that. And ultimately, if it's lease term length, well, the statutory route does offer better value then because it's longer. But of course, if it's longer, it will cost more. It's not, significantly more because it's longer, but it would be a bit more. Question 2, we've kind of dealt with that. The government's going to change the law to mean that all lease extensions are 990 years. Well, that's not law at the moment. The government has said it might like to do that in the future, but it's not the law at the minute. Question 3, my lease is long, 250 years, but it's got a ground rent that rises every 10 years by reference to a value that my flat bears to all the other flats in the building. It's making it difficult to sell. What can I do to get rid of the rent provisions in my lease? Well, so this is something that the Law Commission looked at and said, well, there is a problem for some people because they've got a long lease. So lease length is not their issue. They don't, 250 years is not going to be a problem. But their problem is the ground rent that they're paying. What's their solution? Now, there's no right in law at the moment just to buy out the ground rent. So the solution here would be to do a statutory lease extension, as bonkers as that sounds, to add 90 years on to make the lease 340 years long. But that would be the solution because when you do that, the ground rent under the whole of the lease would be cancelled. And of course, you'd have to pay to do that. You buy that ground rent out, but that would then get round that issue. So that is a solution. Now, what the Law Commission proposed was a right for the leaseholder simply to be able to buy out the ground rent. So you can say, I just want to buy it. 250 years is fine. Just tell me what it costs to get rid of the ground rent. But doing the plus 90-year lease extension in that circumstance, it will more or less amount to the same thing. So I would, say that would be the answer there. The 4th question, I've got a mortgage. Do I need to tell the bank I'm going to be extending my lease? The reason I ask is my lease is 58 years long at the moment and I rent the property out. Can I get a mortgage as things stand? Well, so getting a lease extension, of course, the bank should be delighted with that, really, because you're going to make the property more valuable by making the lease longer. At the moment, 58 years is probably not acceptable for mortgage purposes. Most lenders want to see 75 years. They want to see 25 years on top of the existing lease term. I mean, some would say 50 years plus 25 is 75. In a high value property in central London, that might be acceptable. Somewhere in the suburbs or outside central London, you need to be in the sort of north of 70-year kind of territory, depending on what each lender says. So that's not going to be mortgageable as it stands, unless there's some other arrangement you've got with the bank that we don't know about, such as you happen to have, I don't know, £10 million on deposit with them and they feel very comfortable about lending you more money for that reason. So you would have to tell the bank, obviously. Renting the property out doesn't make a difference one way or the other. I suppose it provides a potential solution. The rental income should service any mortgage debt that's put on to do the extension. But that's about it. So yeah, so you can't get a mortgage as things stand, and this is something else that we don't know about here that means you are in some way a better mortgage risk. Let's have a look at the other questions, and I think there are a couple of others as well. Oh, so here's one about a mixed-use building. We've got more than 25% of the ground floor and basement of our building used as offices and shops at the moment. Our building does not qualify for the right to buy the freehold because more than 25% is not residential. I heard the law is about to change, so we'll be able to buy a freehold. Well, we talked about that earlier on, didn't we, Bob? So it's a proposal. It was discussed in January of this year, discussed only, I think, by MHCLG, consulted on. No clear idea if the law will change or when. It seems to me that government might like to make that change, but that relies upon us having the same government and them still being able to make that change at a future point in time as part of some future programme of legislation, a new common hold and leasehold bill, let's say, that might come in the future. So the answer, unfortunately, is no. If you don't qualify at the moment, you can't buy your freehold. Will you be able to in the future? Wait and see, I suppose, is the answer.
I would imagine that'd be quite controversial, I would think, if that was to be brought forward.
I think it will. I mean, particularly when coupled with the mandatory lease backs, because one thing we didn't touch on when we talked about that is the question of management. So you're going to see a situation where a bunch of residents are going to buy their freehold, and having done that, they're going to co-manage at freehold level with potentially quite a large investor that owns shops or other commercial elements. And I suppose there's a bit of a, the question is who comes out on top in that debate. Now it's 50-50, so actually probably no one does. Is there going to be deadlock on certain issues? Let's say that the estate owner downstairs wants to do certain work which will enhance the value of the estate. Clearly it should be the commercial tenants that pay for some of that, but it might involve also dealing with some residential parts of the building, and the residential people don't want that done. That then frustrates the promotion and development of the former freeholders' business, and might also, in certain circumstances, lead to deadlock and reduction in value, because imagine that works are being frustrated for some reason, and that then leads to the area becoming more dilapidated. Take the example of a run-down shopping centre. That's not good from an investment point of view, and actually also it's not good from a property valuation point of view. But if people are scared or don't want to or can't afford to or don't want to invest, that could be a problem. And you can imagine how, just thinking of a theoretical example, many investors don't live there, they're renting them out. They've got no interest in the appearance of the estate. They've got no interest in doing anything other than receiving the rent. And they don't really want to make the capital investment either. So it's something that could be quite difficult as time progresses. So I think, if that is going to come in, there'll be a lot of consultation with bodies such as the British Property Federation and other representatives of industry to see how that might be made to work in practice. Okay, last one on this slide anyway. I don't know if we've got any more after this one. Oh, come back to that one then, just have the question so people can see it.
Yeah.
So when are the reforms going to come in? Well, I've got a short lease and I'm going to pay marriage value. If this is going to be abolished, should I just wait? Well, this is the $64,000 question, isn't it, really? Well, so the answer to that is as specific as the person asking the question, because, as we've said already, I think hopefully we've made plain this morning, there's no clear timeline as to when these other additional reforms are going to come in. So we don't know that it's going to come in, certainly not tomorrow. And it's not in the Queen's speech. So there's something else that you could hang your hat on there. Yeah. What do you want to do with the property? Are you content to hold it for the long term? Are you prepared to take a bet that the law might change, in which case it will get cheaper compared to what it may have cost today? But will it? Because if it takes 5 or 10 years for the law to change and the lease is 5 or 10 years shorter, the valuation mechanism is still going to reflect the diminishing lease length. So you're going to pay more because the lease is certainly less in length. So it's very, very risky to wait. It's not saying you couldn't wait if your long-term view was, I don't want to change anything. But I don't know. I can't tell you honestly that the law is in fact going to change in that way. Yeah. So that's the first problem. The second problem is people own property for lots of different reasons, but one of the reasons might be as an investment, or it has an investment angle to it, even if it's your home. What happens if you need to sell that property in a hurry, or you need to remortgage it, or you want to do something with it because, let's say, your circumstances change? I mean, if you were elderly and you needed to move out, let's say, well, you want to be able to get as much money for the property as possible when that happens. And with this lease length, you're in a market at the moment where only a cash buyer can buy the property. So that's rather disastrous, because it will definitely reflect the value, and it will downgrade the value that you'll receive for it, because no one will give you credit for the fact the lease can be extended, because it hasn't been extended. So that will always work against you. So I think you've got to be very, very, very careful in situations like this to give the right advice, because it could be that as part of estate planning, someone says, I don't want to make the property more valuable. That's absolutely ideal. Thank you very much. I'll spend the money or invest it somewhere else. Not part of your game. I would be very, very careful about saying, oh, I'll just wait and see now, because I don't think this change is going to come in immediately. And even if it does come in, or when it does come in, how radical is it going to be? Now, we just don't know. Yeah. So
I think that's really good advice, actually. I've got a short lease on my property. I live on my own. I live on the ground floor, and I calculated that it actually is long enough for the rest of my life. Of course, there's an element of risk in that, because if, as you rightly said, if I need to sell and go into home, that will delay, me selling the property. But I calculated that actually, I haven't got a large sum of money to extend my lease at the moment, but I haven't got a mortgage. So that's my calculation, and I think my advice would be, is everyone to sort of make their own calculation, really. But I think anyone who's at some point, like you said, will need to sell the property, either to go into care or to buy a large property or whatever, I would suggest probably getting on with it probably is the best advice, really.
I think that's right. I mean, the thing to do, go and look at one of the online calculators, work out what it will happen, if you make that lease 3 years, 5 years, 10 years shorter, and see how much more you would pay, and see how you feel about that. That's probably the answer in part. We've got a question that's come in. I'm going to deal with that now if I can. So it says, my lease is 118 years and I pay a ground rent that doubles every 25 years. Is it worth to extend the lease after 30th of June 2022 to scrap the ground rent? So, well, a couple of things here. So you pay a ground rent that doubles every 25 years. That's a normal ground rent by the sounds of it. So that's not an issue in itself, although you might want to get rid of it. Is it worth extending the lease after the 30th of June 2022 to scrap the ground rent? Well, you don't need to wait till the 30th of June to scrap the ground rent if you extend that lease under statute. So if you serve a Section 42 notice on the landlord, you will get a new lease that's got 90 years on top of the unexpired term. So you'll have 108 or 208 years, and you'll have no more ground rent to pay. Whether that's worth doing or not is a different question, because at the moment the ground rent may not affect the flat value. We don't know enough to know what that is based on the information here in front of us. But it's not the case that just waiting till after the 30th of June will mean ground will be scrapped. It's possible if you go to the freeholder on a voluntary basis after that date and say, I'd like a lease extension, they will say to you, well, so we can give you a lease with a new, an additional 30, 40, 50 years tacked on the end of it, but you'll have to pay the existing ground rent until the 118 years runs out, because we're allowed to impose that. And then in this new bit of the lease, you can have a nil ground rent. That's how that's likely to work. And I think I'd ask the question, is it worth it? I mean, obviously I'm not a valuer, so I'll predicate this by saying that. But if your lease is 118 years long and the ground rent's not excessive, then does it need to be done? And it's a rhetorical question, but the answer is perhaps not. So you'd need to carry out cost benefit analysis, but we're not obviously going to do casework during this session. So
No.
have a look at one of the calculators on the internet, and then maybe send in a follow-up question to one of the FPRA members or to us at Bishop Sewell.
And then there's one from David Hickman there on right to manage.
Okay, let's have a look at that. Right, okay. So right to manage is difficult for standalone developments, shared space, the underground car parks and energy centres. Any changes anticipated in the RTM? Well, so that's a very good point as well. So the problem with qualification rights for both enfranchisement and right to manage is that they're predicated on the idea of the building as self-standing, that it's a standalone building, that it's capable of management as a site on its own. The problems start when something's built over something else, because of course then the question must be, from an estate management point of view, it's not appropriate to give somebody the management just of the block if the block then sits over services or other things that are underneath it that are used in common with other property. Now, this is a little bit like the Settlers Court RTM case that went to the Supreme Court, but that's a slightly different point, where the question is, well, what do you get when you exercise the right to manage? Well, you get the right to manage the building itself. You can't necessarily get the right to manage other bits of property outside the property itself. Here, there's a further gloss, because the problem is that there's property underneath the property. So it's like a sandwich. The block's sitting on top of something. Here's a flat piece of land, and underneath it is a car park. But the car park doesn't just serve that block. If it just served the block itself, and the walls of the car park are co-extensive with the boundaries of the property, right to manage, no problem at all. If you've got 3 or 4 other blocks also sharing the same car park, then the definition of what the building is, the purpose of both enfranchising and exercising the right to manage, extends out, so that we are talking about the totality of the site. So if there are 5 blocks, suddenly you've got to get 50% of the residents within 5 blocks to join up to this process. Otherwise, you do not have a valid claim. Now, the question asks, are there any proposed changes to the RTM legislation on this ground? There are some proposed changes to RTM. They're a bit about scope for what we're talking about today, but they don't really relate to the qualification criteria. They're more about making the process easier, because I think this is still a philosophical or practical problem that's got to be grappled with. How can we give the management of the block itself to party A and yet have party B and C, let's say, managing other bits which are underneath it? How is the service charge going to work if there are common services, pipes, wires, cables, other things running between these different parts of the site? It is surely better that they are in single ownership and management. So unfortunately, I don't think there are any anticipated changes around that direction, but that's something you're welcome to have a look at. In fact, one of my friends and colleagues, Mark Loveday, who's been very much involved in the Settlers Court decision, has been doing some ministerial briefing on the proposed reforms to the right to manage. So maybe that's another session which the FPRA might like to put on in the future.
Excellent. And I think that brings us probably, does that bring us to our last slide?
I think we are there now, basically.
Well,
yes,
it does,
yes.
yeah. So as I say, that's a nice way to finish, actually, because I think I think right to manage is a topic we haven't done for some time. So maybe that will be something we can. If Mark Loveday's happy to do that, maybe with yourself, we can maybe do a session on that. We'll have a talk about that. But certainly, I think right to manage is definitely worth a session in the future. Obviously, we are at 11 o'clock, so this does bring us to the end of the session. But if you can't get enough of Mark, do please go to the email that the FPRA sent you, or go direct to the Bishop Sewell website and register for 2 o'clock this afternoon and learn everything about the Building Safety Act, so that there is to know. It is a very, very important piece of legislation, and will impact on many of our members, particularly those with responsibility as RMC or RTM directors, who may
certainly in bigger buildings, taller buildings.
Absolutely,
I mean, the interesting question is whether that regime is going to be expanded, to buildings of lower height, let's say, and that's something that we'll be talking about during the course of the afternoon.
Absolutely, and it's why it's one of the questions that we just asked our members. We identified on our application form for members there was nothing about height, so actually we have now asked our members to let us know on our new application form whether the height of the building that is the member of the FPRA is within scope of the Act or not. So I think that's an important question for members to be aware of, really.
Right.
But thanks everyone for joining us. A special thank you for you, Mark, for whistling us through what is a very, very complex area of law and potential changes to the law. It's been really, really interesting. Look forward to your session with Justin this afternoon. Thank you again to Caroline for making sure the slides whizzed along, and thank you for Jackie for answering those questions online and responding to those. Remember, if you want a more detailed response from Mark or one of our honorary consultants, do please email us at info@fpra.org.uk, and we can get a more bespoke answer to your specific questions related to your block. But with that, at the time just gone 11 o'clock-ish, I think, this brings this webinar to a close. And thank you all very much. And the recording will be available within the next 24 hours or so, thanks to John and the IT team for getting that on the members website. It'll be available for members only.
Thank you very much, Bob. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.